everyone, welcome back to my channel. So for this video, we are doing a monthly roundup. However, we have 2 months for this video because I feel like for the past 2 months, I've been so busy that I feel like I haven't really read all that much. So in total over the 2 months, I have 7 books to talk to you about. So I will talk you through my August books first, and then we'll go into September. So if you remember, back in July, I did a random generator, picks my TBR, and that feels like an absolute lifetime ago. So for the month of August, I had all my books laid out for me. So the first book was Jon Ronson, Out of the Ordinary. Jon Ronson is a famous journalist. He writes books, he creates series, he does radio, he does TV. He's a really great journalist, delving into different parts of society. He's so funny, and I saw him at Hay Festival this year. I saw him speak, and he's such an endearing and warm character. So I thought after seeing him, I would love to read one of his books. And this is the one that I had in my TBR. So this book is full of anecdotes and different articles that Jon Ronson has written throughout his career. They are a mix of some more personal stories as well as some commentary on society. And I have to say there were definitely some better stories in here than others, particularly the last one I absolutely loved. It was about how he goes to Stanley Kubrick's house and discovers his hoards and hoards of research that he undertook for each film that he made, and then some films that he didn't actually get to make. That was definitely the strongest one for me, and it was the final story. I sort of in a way wish that this book just focused on more of that story, because I felt like a lot of these stories they were meant to be loosely connected around the theme of society being brought into these like sort of irrational beliefs and getting really hyped up about it. I think the links here were quite weak a lot of the time. A lot of them didn't really feel like they related to that. So yeah, I did like hearing a lot about his family life. I know that he is quite private in many ways, and I think this is one of the more personal books that he has written. I would definitely be keen to read more from him, because I do have a feeling that this maybe isn't his strongest book, but I still loved his funny little stories, and there were some really, really good moments in this book. But I would definitely love to give him another go, because I have listened to a lot of his other material and know that I really like the way he talks and the stories that he tells. So yeah, definitely would like to give it another go. But yeah, not my favourite, but just okay. The next book that was randomly picked for me for the month of August, I was so excited to read this one, so I was so happy when it came up, is Young Mongo by Douglas Stewart. And I feel like I say this every single time I talk about this book, but it is signed, and I was so excited about it. When I met him, he was so nice. So I read Sugar Bane a while ago now. It was either end of last year or beginning of this year, I can't remember now. But I loved Sugar Bane so much, so I was really excited to read another book from Douglas Stewart. So Young Mongo is about a boy named Mongo growing up in a Glasgow housing estate and struggling with his sexuality. He is sort of living in the shadow of his brother, who is the sort of lead member of the gang in the housing estate. And his brother sort of expects him to follow in his footsteps, but Mongo just does not relate to him at all. In contrast to the other boys on the estate, Mongo is a very gentle soul who just wants to be protected by his mum, but his mum is in the depths of alcoholism, which means that his sister has to look after him and become a sort of mother figure. But no matter how much his mum does wrong to Mongo, Mongo cannot accept that she is not a great mother to him, and all he wants is to be looked after, which obviously is in stark contrast to his older brother, who leads this gang, is very violent and wants the same for Mongo. Because of this, Mongo finds refuge in his new friend that he makes called James. Now, James is a bit of a character. He sort of captures birds and keeps them in a hut in the estate. He's a bit of an outcast, a bit of a recluse. But James and Mongo become fast friends and soon become very, very close. Now, when I read the blurb of this book, it said this book was a gay Romeo and Juliet, and now I can see why, because it's inevitable that James and Mongo end up falling in love. However, James is a Catholic and Mongo is a Protestant, and at the time in Glasgow, this is not accepted at all. For them to even be friends, let alone be falling in love. So they are at the risk of extreme violence towards them, but they carry on with this relationship regardless. I feel like this book had a really similar feel to Shuggie Bain in the sense that it's about poverty in Glasgow, and I think Douglas Stewart does that so well. I think a lot of the time he can draw from his experiences growing up. I don't know in detail his experiences growing up, but I think he does use a lot of his own experiences in his book. He really paints a harrowing picture of living in a segregated community whilst as well living in poverty. In both of these books that he's written, so Young Mungo and Shuggie Bain, both of the mothers are alcoholics and the boys just sort of want to be loved by the mother. And I think he does this so well. He really pulls at the heartstrings, and he's so good at painting a picture of all the different characters that you can come into contact with in these sort of communities and these estates. But I would love to see what else he could do. I loved Young Mungo so much, and I also love Shuggie Bain so much, but I almost want to see it moving on just a touch to see what else he can cover and other subject matters that he can talk about, because I love the way he writes. I completely fall for the characters every single time and I'm rooting for them so much. But yeah, this was a really devastating book, split across two timelines. It's the current day Mongo sort of reflecting on the past year sort of his life. And as such a young boy going through all of these things, you can't help but really feel for him. So I love this book a lot. If you like Shuggie Bain, then you are definitely going to like Young Mungo, that is for sure. And I can't wait to see what Douglas Stewart comes out with next, and I'm definitely going to read it because yeah, I love his writing so much. So big success, love this one. The next book on my list, which again I was so excited came up because I've been wanting to read it for so long. I feel like it's been on my TBR for ages, and that is The Idiot by Elif Batuman. And this is centered around a young girl called Selin who goes to Harvard University. And for me, this book was sort of split into two halves. The first half was Selin living in Harvard, going to lectures, and I just absolutely loved that atmosphere. I loved reading about that. I loved seeing what subject she was taking and her just exploring Harvard, living with her roommates. That was just the vibes I was after. But this book is set in the 90s, sort of the time when email is coming in, and one day Selin takes up an email correspondence with a guy who's in her Russian class, I think it's her Russian class, called Ivan, and they start chatting over email, and Selin sort of falls in love. This is her first love, and it's safe to say she becomes obsessed with Ivan. So after some correspondence over email, they decide to meet up. However, Ivan has a girlfriend already, but Selin absolutely idolizes Ivan, hangs onto his every word. So when at the end of the school year, Ivan suggests that Selin comes to Hungary to do a summer of teaching, she sort of jumps at the chance. Even though he's not going to be on the course, he just lives there, so he will be there for the summer, so she might be able to steal a few moments of his time. So she goes to Hungary, lives in this remote Hungarian village teaching English. One thing I really loved about this story is seeing Selin and how she interacts with Ivan. In daily life, she is quite a shy, awkward person, but over email, she really opened up to Ivan and came alive. However, in normal life, when they're together, she really struggles to still communicate her feelings, as this is her first love. She's never had a boyfriend before, so she doesn't really know how to deal with these emotions. But Ivan is this confident young man with a girlfriend. This contrast between the two of them really highlights the power dynamic and how much of a influence Ivan has over Selin. So when she goes to this remote Hungarian village where she knows no one, she sort of struggles to form relationships and makes friends. I think for this book, it was sort of split into two halves for me. The first half was her in Harvard and the second half was her in Hungary. I definitely liked the first half a lot more, and I think because Selin is so shy and introverted a lot of the time, I was struggling to see the point of having her set in Hungary where she doesn't know people for a whole half of the book, because There are not many meaningful conversations or relationships that she's formed when she's in Hungary. So I would have preferred if there was just a much smaller snippet set in Hungary, personally, because at times it felt a bit rambling and a little bit pointless. And it felt like that in a way at Harvard, but I really loved the sort of rambling aspect of it and the first half set in that college campus environment. But in Hungary, for me, it didn't work so well. It made the book feel a little bit slower and a bit harder for me to get through. So overall, I thought it was a great book. I loved reading it, especially the first half. But yeah, I would have loved if the Hungary section was just a little bit smaller. But I loved seeing Selin deal with her sort of first love and deal with his emotions whilst in the setting of starting a new college and being in a new environment with Harvard and Hungary. So yeah, overall a really enjoyable book. And I believe there is a second one to this, which I would definitely be keen to read. Then the final book that I read in August was Sweet Thursday by John Steinbeck. And this is a carry-on from Cannery Row, which I read back in January. I've spoken about it loads. I absolutely loved it. It's set in the same town with the same people, but this one is set just after the war, and it's set around a scientist called Doc and him sort of dealing with his mental health after the war and struggling with a feeling of purpose, but loneliness as well. When the people in the town notice that Doc is feeling a bit down and not himself, they make it their purpose to make him feel better, rightly or wrongly. So amongst themselves, they sort of make it their mission to find Doc, one, a wife, and give him a party that he deserves. Now, if you've read Cannery Row, you will know that this sort of story feels very familiar because in Cannery Row, they give Doc a birthday party. So the story does feel very similar and has a very similar structure. I think if you liked Cannery Row and you loved the environment and you loved the characters, then you will love reading about them again because I think they're so endearing, each and every one of them. So I really enjoyed this book, but I did wish that it had a different storyline because it almost felt like an identical storyline, to be honest. Obviously there are a few changes here and there, but for the most part it didn't feel overly different from Cannery Row. I don't feel like it had overly moved on in any way. However, I did still love it just because I love that setting and I loved Cannery Row so much. But yeah, it was a really good book, but yeah, very, very similar to Cannery Row. But I love that book, so I'm not complaining too much. So they are the books that I read in August. Then onto the books I read in September. I only have 3 here. It was a very busy month for me. I went away to New York, which was absolutely amazing, but did mean that I didn't read as many books as I would have liked to. However, the first book that I read in September was one that I wanted to get to for so long, and I was so happy I did because I absolutely loved it, and that was Hidden Valley Road by Robert Kolker. And I have heard so many people talk about this book, saying how amazing it was, so I couldn't wait to get to it. It's such an interesting book that is a mix of real life story around a family and then also lots of scientific research. So if you don't know, this book is about a young American couple living in Colorado, and they end up having 12 children in total, 10 of which are boys and 6 of which have schizophrenia. This is sort of a deep dive into why this could have happened, how this could have happened. It goes into their family life. Robert Kolker has done extensive research on the family with the help of some of the family members to really look back on their whole life of the parents and both the children and all the children to see how this could have possibly happened. And is it nature or is it nurture? That is sort of the debate throughout this story. Mixed in with this story about the couple is a lot of scientific research that was being undertaken at the time. This was sort of set around the 50s, 60s, I believe, where not a lot was really known about schizophrenia and why it came about. I think even to this day, there are still so many questions around it, which made it such an interesting topic to read about. I think Robert Kolker has done this so well. And there are lots of complex ideas and theories in here, but Robert Kolker makes it so digestible, and also so interesting to read about. I highly recommend this book for anyone who may not have read it, because like I said, this topic is still being widely researched by scientists with not many answers, to be honest. So yeah, such an interesting story. Really enjoyed it. Highly recommend this book. As I said, I went to New York this month, so therefore I had to get a book set in New York to read whilst I was there. And I picked up this one, which is The Beautiful and Damned by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I love this book a lot. It's set in New York in the 1920s, centered around a young couple called Gloria and Anthony. And they are, like it says, young and beautiful and living amongst the rich elite society in New York. Anthony is due a very large inheritance from his grandfather, but this makes him very lazy and work shy as he awaits this money. He sort of rejects responsibility, always waiting for that money, waiting. But in the meantime, him and Gloria really struggle with money and really struggle with a sense of purpose in their life, which leads to a really volatile relationship between the two of them. They both use partying and alcohol as their vice, which has some devastating consequences for both their personal lives individually and for their personal lives as a couple. This book is a real study on their relationship and their belief that money will bring happiness. But will it really bring happiness? That is the big question. I really enjoyed this book. I actually have not read anything by F. Scott Fitzgerald before. I have not read The Great Gatsby, which is just crazy. So after reading this book, I'm definitely going to pick up The Great Gatsby and give it a read because I really love the writing. So yeah, highly recommend this one if you haven't read it already. Then the final book that I read this month was definitely the strangest of the month, and that was Slapstick or Lonesome No More by Kurt Vonnegut. And where to even begin with this book? It was just the strangest book that I have ever read. I know that Kurt Vonnegut writes a lot of strange and wacky books, and that's what I love him for, but this one was just on a new level. I would definitely say if you haven't read a Kurt Vonnegut before, I would not start with this one. I would definitely not start with this one. It wasn't my favourite book by him for sure. I'm glad I read it because I really like his writing and I would love to read all of his books eventually. But yeah, I would not start with this one because it was not my favourite. It's just a short little book. It is about an old man living in the Empire State Building in sort of a post-apocalyptic New York, and he is reflecting on his very unusual life. It starts from when he was a baby, when he was born. He was a twin, and him and his twin were sort of banished to a solitary house, a big grand house. His parents are very rich because they were seen as too ugly to be seen by society and be integrated into society. Him and his twin sister become very close, and when they put their heads together, they become geniuses. But when they are apart, they are lacking very basic skills such as reading and writing. Then fast forward many years and many different events, which I won't spoil for you because half of the fun is discovering Vonnegut's weird and wonderful writing. But this man then becomes the president of the United States, and some of his ideals and the way he wants to run the country mean that the country then falls into ruin. And that's all I'll really say about it, because in a way I almost don't know what to say about this book, but half of the fun is sort of enjoying and experiencing Vonnegut's writing. I love where his imagination takes him, and I really admire that. He sort of has like a almost childlike feel to the way he writes. Just the way his mind goes is like no one else, and I just really love that about his writing. So even though it wasn't my favourite one, I still loved reading it, and I will definitely read more from him. Maybe don't go in with this book if you've not read any of his books before. But yeah, a really fun book that I would say, and you know, it didn't take long to get through either. So yeah, happy I read it. So they are all the books that I read in August and September. I hope you got some book recommendations from this video. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next one.